So yes, there are many, many weird and wonderful things, well, weird and horrible in many cases, things that the Victorians thought were appropriate to do with mummies, and indeed before that in the 18th century people thought were appropriate things to do with mummies. So we're going to go through some of those today. And I guess we go right back to why they are called mummies. And that takes us back, effectively, right back to the time of likes of Pliny and Dioscorides in the Roman world, because it was widely believed that, that bitumen was useful for them. They weren't getting it out of mummies, but they had decided that bitumen was a good thing to get hold of. And bitumen is this sort of black tar substance that it does ooze from the ground in a few places, but they'd kind of used up some of the supplies over the next few hundred years of natural bitumen. So they were looking in the 11th, 12th century for new sources of bitumen, because they've got all these recipes from the time of Pliny that say, yep, it's great, use it on your toothache, or yep, it's great, use it for your dysentery, and so on and so forth. Not sure bitumen will actually do you good in any of these cases, but as with anything that the likes of Dioscorides wrote down, it was widely believed. So in the 12th century, Abd el-Latif, among others, scholars of the Arab world, had looked at some mummies and noticed they have this very oily, dark brown kind of appearance, and made the assumption that they contain bitumen, or else, as he puts it, something in the hollows of corpses in Egypt that differs but immaterially from bitumen. If it's not bitumen, it's close enough. And he says, where any difficulty arises in procuring the latter, may be substituted in its stead. So he says, you can't get hold of bitumen, use powdered mummy instead. And it's actually true that a fair few mummies do have bitumen in it. It just depends whether you get them from the start or the end of the period. You go right back to the early dynasties, it's not a thing at all. Whereas if you look at the ones in Roman times, it's almost all of them. And there's like a tipping point in between. So you might get lucky, or you might not, or you might know which ones to pick. Now, the Persian word for bitumen is mummaya, and that's why mummies are mummies. For hundreds of years, the word mummia could refer to a mummy, or it could refer to bitumen. So if you were asking, went to the market to buy mummia, you might not get quite what you were expecting. Now, anything that was, or that they thought was, coated in bitumen, as I say, loads of medical uses. By the 16th century, there is a big business exporting medicinal mummies to Europe. And there are traders from right across Europe, England, Spain, France, Germany, all of whom want in on the action because it's very lucrative selling these mummies. And tombs were being raided at an unprecedented rate. There's a frightening quote from a chap called John Sanderson, who worked for the Turkey Company, who were involved in doing this. And he visited the what he called mummy pits of Memphis in 1586. And he says, we were let down by ropes as into a well, with wax candles burning in our hands, and so walked upon the bodies of all sorts and sizes. They gave no noisome smell at all. I broke off all of the parts of the bodies to see how the flesh was turned to drug, and brought home divers heads, hands, arms, and feet for a show. We brought also £600 for the Turkey Company in pieces, and brought into England in the Hercules, together with a whole body. They are lapped in above 100 double of cloth, which rotting and piling off, you may see the skin, flesh, fingers and nails firm, altered black. One little hand I brought into England to show, and presented it to my brother, who gave the same to a doctor in Oxford. People are already collecting these as being interesting. A little before that, a chap called Guy de la Fontaine, who was physician to the King of Navarre in 1564, he'd tried to investigate the trade in Alexandria, and he had gone to a key dealer in the trade and asked to look at his stock, and got talking with them and found out that a significant number of the mummies were in fact not ancient Egyptian at all. They were much more recently dead, generally criminals, slaves, people that nobody would miss. When they died, or possibly when they were helped along their way in a Burke and Hare style, they would be treated with bitumen and then just left out in the sun to dry, and then they could be sold for a large sum of money. One merchant said that in choosing these new mummies, he didn't care if they died of a nasty disease or whether they were old or young or male or female, as when embalmed no one could tell. Doesn't matter who they are. And for smaller pieces, you could sell smaller pieces. Of course, they didn't have to be human in the first place. You could use bits of camel perfectly adequately. You chop up your bits of camel and dry them out and cover them in bitumen. Both locals and visitors were digging up tombs and transporting mummies, taking them to Cairo and then on from there. Abdul Latif records that in Cairo it sold for a trifle. For half a dirham I purchased 3 heads filled with the substance. So what are they using these for? For a start, even in the early times, they were an attraction in and of themselves. Samuel Pepys in 1668 visited a dockside waterhouse to see a mummy before it was ground up. So you can get double value for it. You still get the medicinal, but first of all, any tourists want to see it, take their coin. And he said, and so parted, I having there seen a mummy in a merchant's warehouse there, all the middle of the man or woman's body black and hard. I never saw any before, and therefore it pleased me much, though an ill sight. And he did give me a little bit, and a bone of an arm. Again, they have no worries about separating these things up, commodifying them totally. Gentlemen would commonly, even at this point, buy pieces to place in the burgeoning hobby of collecting cabinets of curiosity. But the main draw in the 16th and 17th century was to use in medicine. It might be rubbed on, put into an ointment, it might be mixed in with a drink. Standard pharmacopoeias include this, and it's a common drug that you would find in most good apothecaries' shops, certainly on decent trade routes. It's not a rare ingredient at all. You might make it into a tincture by soaking it in wine or in terps, as if it's not bad enough already being bitumen flavoured, and then reducing it down to honey-like consistency. You could have it as a treacle, you could mix it with pearls and coral and musk and all sorts, because treacles are supposed to have multiple ingredients in, or a balsam, which is what happens if you dissolve it in oil. Francis Bacon said you could use it to staunch wounds. Robert Boyle recommended it for falls and bruises, and John Hall, who is Shakespeare's son-in-law, used it, who was a doctor, used it in epilepsy treatment. Shakespeare himself includes it, of course, because he has a witch's mummy within the ingredients that he has the witches in Macbeth placed within the cauldron. Another fan was Catherine de Medici, who sent her chaplain to Egypt to get some for her medicine, and also Francis I of France, who supposedly carried a pouch of mummia and powdered rhubarb mixed with him at all times, and he said that he feared no accident if he had but a little of that by him. And of course all of this is because it's thought that the mummy is thought to contain not only the bitumen that the ancients had said was useful, but also a kind of life force. Because it was once alive, there's something within it which is moved to the patient when you eat it. Some people went one further and thought if there's a life force involved, then why not just use recently dead people? Paracelsus thought that newer corpses would be just as good, if not better. He says if doctors were aware of this substance, no body would be left on the gibbet more than 3 days. But most people, I think, drew the line somewhere in between Egyptian mummies and recently dead people. Not that they knew that what they were using might well actually have been recently dead people. Not everyone is so enthusiastic, even at this early time. One of the Egyptian traders was amazed that the Christians, so dainty-mouthed, could yet eat the bodies of the dead. Some people criticised the monetisation of the whole process. One philosopher in 1658 said, "The Egyptian mummies avarice now consumeth. Mummy is become merchandise. Sure such diet is dismal vampirism." Or more practically, physician Ambrose Paré said that it doesn't do you any good, and instead it's likely to give you stomachache, vomiting and bad breath. So yeah, I wouldn't bother really. Even into the 18th century, mummy is still being prescribed for all sorts of things. Coughs, swelling, joint problems, epilepsy, difficult labours, measles scarring, lots of different things. But it gradually dies out in the late 18th, very early 19th century. But at exactly the same point, mummies are gaining a different function. Rather than being seen primarily as medicinal, their relationship with the Western world changed. Napoleon occupied Egypt in 1798, and public interest in all things Egyptian really swelled at that point. There was a burst of Egypt mania. And the early 19th century, all things Egyptian are popular, and anyone who could afford it will be trying to collect mummies to have a piece of mummy on their shelf along with any other Egyptian artifacts they can get hold of. So the main purpose of them is not now to grind them up, it's to keep them. In 1834, there's a monk, Father Jeram, who remarks to Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, no, not that Muhammad Ali, he said, "It would be hardly respectable on one's return from Egypt to present oneself without a mummy in one hand and a crocodile in the other." One might argue that's a great holiday there. Presumably a dead crocodile. There was also a fashion for attending mummy unwrappings, sometimes a small group of scientists, but very often done with ticket sales and done as a financial venture. This started off with Giovanni Belzoni, who had a background as a circus performer and an antiques salesman, and he started it by having a public unwrapping within a bigger exhibition of Egyptian finds. And one of the attendees of that was a chap called Thomas Pettigrew, who took on the idea and started doing all his own events. And Thomas Pettigrew got so popular in doing it, he became widely known as Mummy Pettigrew. Slightly unfortunate. He was a surgeon, an antiquarian, a scholar, but still very much a showman. And he conducted at least 50, maybe more, unrollings, as they would call it, from the lecture theatre of Charing Cross Hospital, as well as in private gatherings in people's homes. People might have a mummy unwrapping as a special event in their own home. He did at least lecture on the process as he went through. He was interested in the scientific angle of it. He did kind of move the field on by starting to talk about what could you tell about this person's life and their health before they were mummified. He was actually looking at them as sources of information as well as sources of entertainment and wonder. On the other hand, one of the things that he thought you could tell from the mummy, or one of the things he was trying to tell, was to use cranial measurements to determine that Egyptians were basically Caucasian, not African. So not all of his science was terribly well based, but he did, despite doing all this showmanship, also take the field further. Another unwrapping was at the exhibition of 1857, and we have an example of a description of that one. That the work of unrolling the bandages began. The outer envelope of stout linen was ripped open with scissors. A faint, delicate odour of balsam, incense, and other aromatic drugs spread through the room like the odour of an apothecary's shop. The end of the bandage was then sought for, and when found, the mummy was placed upright to allow the operator to move freely around her and to roll up the endless band, turned to the yellow colour of ecru linen by the palm wine and the other preserving liquids. A vast quantity of linen filled the room, and we could not help wondering how a box which was scarcely larger than an ordinary coffin had managed to hold it all. He also mentions that within this, they very often found little blue enamel figures and shapes. And he said that so many unwrappings had happened that similar to these could now be found in any curiosity shop. Presumably a lot of them were fakes, though. And yeah, the idea that they were done in individual houses has been disputed. I think it probably did happen, but not very often. There's an example of a invite Lord Londesbury at home, a mummy from Thebes to be unrolled at 2:30 after dinner and a drink to get you in the mood, but it may not have been very common. Much more common is that cabinets of curiosity continue to have these parts in them, and that the house of anyone who could afford it, you might just find random bits of mummy kicking around. The writer Flaubert had a mummy's foot on his desk, just because he could. And one Chicago sweet shop, as late as 1886, had a mummy in its window. It was a sweet shop with a mummy displaying it. And it was described by the sweet shop adverts as being the daughter of Pharaoh who had discovered Moses in the bulrushes. Not just any old mummy, this is a very important one. The adverts would commonly claim to be somebody of high rank. You can get more money and better audience for that, can't you? And they are usually displayed to raise money. So, for instance, hundreds of people pay 25 cents each to see what is described as being the first complete human mummy in America. And the city had been given this mummy, and then the city gave it to the then brand new Massachusetts General Hospital, who then raised lots of money with it. The chemical composition can continue to be exploited. If there's bitumen in there, well, that's useful. And there's a rumour that mummies were sometimes burned for their bitumen. For instance, to fuel the equipment used to dig the Suez Canal, or to power the Egyptian railroads. Now, this probably comes from a piece in Mark Twain in The Innocents Abroad, which reports that the railroad companies are using them as fuel purchased by the ton or by the graveyard. He's probably joking or at least exaggerating. The Innocents Abroad is presented as reportage, but it is a little tongue-in-cheek, and he does add to that section, stated by me for a fact. I only tell it as I got it. I am willing to believe it. I can believe anything. So that gives you some idea. There is a bit more evidence that they were being imported to turn the linen and the papyrus into paper. During the American Civil War, there was a shortage of rags, of all things, and there definitely was an importation of rags from Egypt to turn into rag paper. Whether any of those rags came from mummies is harder to determine, but it's possible. And that coarse rag paper would then be used by grocers as wrapping paper and that sort of thing. Something very unpleasant did definitely happen, though, to some of the animal mummies. Now, ancient Egyptians didn't just mummify people. They mummified huge numbers of baboons and ibises, and most especially cats, because obviously cats were sacred, cats were associated with the goddess Bastet, and they were very often sacrificed to the goddess Bastet, and part of that would involve mummifying them. In 1888, a farmer in Egypt was digging in his field when he fell into a catacomb filled with literally hundreds of thousands of cats mummified. One contemporary described this as being a seam of cats, like a coal seam. Far too many to sell as individuals. There wasn't a market for them. They tried selling a few as individuals at very low prices, but there were just, what do you do with hundreds of thousands of them? So increasingly they started selling them en masse, and it's not a pretty picture when you look at this. There is no, well, I guess there's even less respect for cat bodies than there is for the human mummies. So they're bought up by the ton and brought to England, pulverised into fertiliser and spread on the fields. One account, for instance, says that 19.5 tons, which is roughly 180,000 cats, was sold at £6, 13 shillings and 9 pence per ton on the docks of Liverpool, bought as a job lot. Of that job lot, one skull survives. It's in the British Museum, and I've seen some reference that there might be some bits at a museum in Liverpool. The auctioneer used a cat's skull as his hammer, the story goes, so maybe that's the one that survives. I don't know how effective that would be anyway, but maybe that's the one that escaped from being bundled up and taken to the others, and that one's in the British Museum. As a slightly more humorous addendum to that, in the 1930s in Scotland, a field was found to be full of ancient arrowheads. They were coming up into the plough, all these strange arrowheads, and when the archaeologists looked at them, they found out that they were not of a kind that should be found in Northern Europe. And there was a whole lot of excitement as to, is this a whole new trading network or a whole new culture that hadn't previously been discovered, cultural connections. Group of archaeologists travelled up, extremely excited by this find, until it was realised that they had arrived in a field which had been treated with cat fertiliser 50 years earlier, and within all of the bandages, the wrappings of the mummies, there would have been little arrowheads and little gifts. So yes, they had to backtrack very quickly on their theories. Another use for the mummies, and the human ones as well, was to make the rich brown paint that was known as mummy brown, or caput mortuum. And apparently in colour it is somewhere between a raw umber and a burnt umber, which I can't help but think means that it's a cooked umber, but that's the colour we're looking at. And yeah, this was very popular amongst some artists. Artists seem to have argued as to whether it was a very good paint or not, and it seems possibly it varied quite a lot depending on where the mummies had come from, because obviously the composition of the different mummies at different times changed, so people knew that it might be of different quality. One artist concluded that one is in the dark as to his materials and can predict nothing with even ordinary certainty, as is the result of their employment. Others said it couldn't do anything that other browns couldn't, but there were artists that swore by it as providing beautiful even washes on things. One artist's supply shop in Paris opened in 1712 with the name à la momie, from the mummy. Edward Burne-Jones used the stuff, famous pre-Raphaelite artist. Had been using it for some time when, over one Sunday lunch, his friend Lawrence Alma-Tadema, another painter, told him where Mummy Brown actually came from. Edward Burne-Jones seems to have just believed that it was a descriptive rather than an actual, rather than actually telling you what it was made out of. He thought it was just the colour of mummies. He was absolutely horrified and promptly went indoors, picked out his one tube of Mummy Brown, took it into the garden, dug a hole and buried it. Now, weirdly, Rudyard Kipling was there at the time. He was quite young. He was a nephew of Edward's wife, Georgina, and he, in later years, wrote, "We all went out and helped, according to the rites of Mizraim and Memphis, I hope. And to this day I could drive a spade within a foot of where that tube lies." Must have made a great impression on the lad. The use of it crashes in the early 20th century, mostly I think due to public distaste growing of it, and in spite of the second sort of wave of Egypt mania in the 20s and 30s. Robertson's of London was still selling it until around the war, but in very small quantity. It was a real specialist item. As it happens, my great-great-grandfather, Edward Arthur Jeffrey, was at one point an oil artist's colour man, which leads to a fair chance that at some point he was having to grind up mummies to make this brown paint, which I find quite amazing. But attitudes did gradually change. The last known mummy unwrapping was in 1908 in Manchester, and Weirdly, it was done by Margaret Murray, who was the first woman to be appointed as a lecturer in archaeology in the UK. Not sure whether or not she was the first woman to do a mummy unwrapping, but she was the last. There is a picture of her with the mummy in front of her, which is quite dramatic, quite an eye-catching image. 500 people turned out to watch. Finally, of course, if we're thinking of uses of mummies, one can say there is the use not in a physical sense, but in a sense of adding to our imaginations. Of course, they're a staple of horror, certainly your sort of Hammer horror type of staple. And there's always been a bit of an element of that. After all, if they can have a life force that can help make you better, then is there a potential of there being some kind of spiritual, supernatural aspect to that? As early as the 16th century, there were stories that the ships that were carrying mummies back were particularly prone to storms, and storms could be called up. When the Holy Roman Empire beat the Turkish fleet at sea in 1571, it was rumoured that that was because one of the Turkish ships had had a mummy on board. But that's about as far as it goes for quite a long time. And weirdly, the first fictional mummies that are living within the story are not anything like the later ones. They tend to be female, and they tend to be presented weirdly as the love interest in the story. So The Mummy's Foot by Gautier in 1840, if you remember, keeping a foot on your desk was a thing that some people did. Bram Stoker's Jewel of the Seven Stars and Rider Haggard's She all feature the idea of a female mummy coming back in order to reclaim a love, gain a love. The monster mummy, as we know it now, very much comes from the Karloff film of the name from 1932. Then we're getting into modern film history and an area I don't know enough about to really comment, but it seems very interesting, and it's almost odd it takes that long for us to think of them as something that haunts us, given all the horrible ways we'd been treating them for hundreds of years before that. You'd think somebody would have started to feel slightly guilty about it, but it turns out us being scared of mummies is probably justified if any of them get a say in the matter. So there you go. Sweet dreams on that one.